The last photograph ever taken of Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen shows them smiling peacefully at the base of Mount Sacred Heart, their pilgrimage just beginning. That was September 15th, 1987. For 15 years, no trace of the three nuns was ever found, despite massive search efforts, until a single flashlight beam pierced through the darkness of a hidden cave, illuminating something that would make a seasoned hiker drop to his knees in shock. Before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more stories like this one. Sister Margaret O'Connor had been planning this pilgrimage for months. At 45, she was the senior member of their trio and carried herself with the quiet authority that came from 23 years of religious life. Her weathered hands moved efficiently as she checked and rechecked their supplies in the pre-dawn darkness of St. Catherine's Convent. Every item had been carefully selected. Emergency flares, enough food for 3 days instead of 2. A first aid kit that would make a paramedic proud, and her father's old compass, a relic from his Navy days that had never failed her. "You worry too much, Maggie," Sister Rose Martinez teased, using the nickname she'd given Margaret years ago when they first met in the novitiate. At 32, Rose was the heart of their small group, the one who could make anyone laugh even during the most solemn moments. Her infectious energy had transformed the convent school into the most beloved institution in 3 counties. Children would run to her in the hallways, and she somehow remembered every single name, every birthday, every small triumph and heartbreak. Sister Helen Thompson sat quietly in the corner, methodically braiding her long auburn hair before tucking it beneath her wimple. At 28, she was the youngest and newest to the religious life, having taken her final vows only 2 years earlier. Helen had joined the convent after losing her fiancé in a car accident, seeking solace in prayer and service. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of someone who had stared into the abyss of grief and chosen hope instead. The 3 women represented everything beautiful about their religious community: Margaret's wisdom, Rose's joy, and Helen's profound spirituality created a harmony that had strengthened their entire convent. Mother Superior Catherine often said that watching them together was like witnessing the Trinity in human form, different aspects of divine love working in perfect unity. As the first light of dawn crept through the chapel windows, the nuns gathered for morning prayers. The entire convent joined them, 47 sisters ranging in age from 22 to 89, their voices rising in harmony as they sang the ancient hymns that had echoed through these halls for over a century. Sister Agnes, the convent's historian, had reminded them the night before that they were continuing a tradition that stretched back to the monastery's founding in 1889, when the first brave souls had carved a chapel into the mountainside with nothing but hand tools and unwavering faith. Father Miguel Rodriguez arrived precisely at 6 a.m., as punctual as always. The chaplain was a bear of a man with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a youth spent in construction before he heard God's call. He had served St. Catherine's for 12 years, and these 3 nuns were like daughters to him. He tried to hide his concern as he blessed their backpacks, each piece of equipment, and finally, the women themselves. "The weather forecast is perfect," he assured them, though his eyes betrayed a worry he couldn't quite name. Clear skies, no chance of rain, temperatures in the mid-60s during the day. You'll have ideal conditions for reflection and prayer. The drive to the trailhead took 45 minutes through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily toward the tree line. Father Rodriguez's old Chevy pickup wheezed and complained with each switchback, but it had been making this journey twice a year for over a decade, carrying pilgrims to and from their sacred destination. "Tell me again about the shrine," Helen requested softly. Despite having heard the story countless times, she never tired of the history. Father Rodriguez smiled in the rearview mirror. In 1923, a group of Franciscan monks received a vision directing them to build a shrine to the Sacred Heart, high on the mountain. They spent 3 years carrying materials up the trail by hand. Every stone, every piece of timber, even the bronze plaque that marks the site. The shrine has been a place of miracles ever since. Pilgrims have reported healings, visions, profound spiritual experiences. Some say if you pray there with a pure heart, you can hear the voice of God in the mountain wind. Rose bounced excitedly, in her seat. I still can't believe we're finally doing this together. I've been dreaming about this pilgrimage since I was a novice. Margaret smiled at her younger sister's enthusiasm. Just remember, this isn't a nature hike. We're not tourists taking pictures for our scrapbooks. This is a spiritual journey, a chance to draw closer to God through sacrifice and prayer. I know, Rose laughed. But that doesn't mean we can't enjoy the incredible creation God has given us to walk through. The trailhead parking area was empty, except for a Forest Service truck and a single car with California plates. A hand-painted sign warned hikers about bear activity and reminded them to register at the ranger station 5 miles up the trail. The official pilgrimage route was marked with small wooden crosses every half mile, each one carved with a different biblical verse about faith and perseverance. As Father Rodriguez helped them unload their gear, a figure emerged from the Forest Service building. Ranger Tom Mitchell was a third-generation Colorado native whose grandfather had actually helped the Franciscan monks carry materials up the mountain in the 1920s. He knew every inch of these trails and every person who regularly used them. "Morning, Father," Tom called out, approaching their group. "Right on schedule, as always. Weather's going to be perfect for your ladies." He turned to the 3 nuns with a genuine smile. "I've got your permits right here, and I updated the trail conditions report this morning. No problems anywhere along. The route, the stream crossing at mile 3, is running a little high from last week's rain, but there's a perfectly good log bridge just upstream." Margaret accepted the permits and studied the detailed map Tom provided. Every potential hazard was marked, every emergency shelter noted, every escape route clearly indicated. She had walked this trail 6 times before, but she still treated each pilgrimage as if it were her first. "The ranger station at mile 5 is fully stocked if you need anything," Tom continued. "Fresh water, emergency supplies, and a radio that connects directly to our dispatch center. I'll be there myself today doing some maintenance work, so don't hesitate to stop by even if you don't need anything. I always enjoy hearing about your spiritual experiences up there." The 3 nuns posed for their final photograph together at the trailhead marker. Rose insisted on holding up the small wooden crucifix that would guide them to the shrine, while Margaret consulted her father's compass one last time. Helen simply smiled serenely, her prayer book clutched against her chest. Already lost in contemplation of the sacred journey ahead, Father Rodriguez watched them disappear around the first bend of the trail, their voices carrying back on the morning breeze as they began the traditional pilgrimage hymns. The melody of "How Great Thou Art" echoed through the pine trees long after they vanished from sight, and he stood there listening until even the echo faded into silence. He would later tell investigators that he had felt completely at peace watching them go. They were experienced hikers, devout women, and the weather was perfect. Nothing in that moment suggested he would never see any of them alive again. But as their voices faded into the wilderness, the 3 nuns were walking toward an encounter that would test their faith in ways they could never have imagined, and ultimately cost them everything they held dear. The first few miles of the pilgrimage trail were exactly as the 3 nuns had expected. The path wound through dense stands of aspen and pine, their footsteps muffled by centuries of fallen needles. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wild columbines and the distant sound of running water. For Margaret, Rose, and Helen, this was more than a hike. It was a moving meditation, each step bringing them closer to the divine. They maintained their traditional pace, walking in contemplative silence for 30 minutes, then pausing to pray, together before continuing. During their prayer stops, they would read from scripture, share personal reflections, and offer intentions for the people they served back at the convent. Rose carried a notebook filled with prayer requests from her students, while Helen had promised to pray for 17 specific intentions submitted by fellow nuns who couldn't make the journey. At the stream crossing Tom Mitchell had mentioned, they encountered another hiker coming down the trail. The man appeared to be in his early 40s, muscular and tanned from years of outdoor work. He wore expensive hiking gear and carried a professional-grade backpack that suggested serious mountain experience. Most importantly, he wore a small silver cross around his neck and spoke with the easy familiarity of someone who understood their mission. "Good morning, sisters," he called out with a warm smile. "Beautiful day for a pilgrimage. I'm Jake Morrison, and I've been hiking these mountains for over 20 years. I actually help coordinate some of the search and rescue operations in this area." Margaret felt immediately at ease. The man's respectful demeanor and obvious experience made her relax the maternal vigilance she always felt when her younger sisters were in unfamiliar territory. "I'm Sister Margaret, and these are Sisters Rose and Helen. We're from St. Catherine's Convent, heading up to the Sacred Heart Shrine." Jake's face lit up with recognition. "Of course. I've heard wonderful things about your annual pilgrimages. In fact, I was just coming down from the shrine area myself. I spend a lot of time up there maintaining some of the emergency shelters and checking on trail conditions." Rose stepped forward eagerly. "How were the conditions at the shrine?" "We've been planning this journey for months." "Absolutely perfect," Jake assured her. "Clear views all the way to the Continental Divide, and the shrine itself is in beautiful condition. Someone's been maintaining it well." He paused, as if struck by a sudden thought. "Actually, I'm glad I ran into you ladies. There's something special happening up there today that most pilgrims never get to experience." Helen looked up from her prayer book with interest. "What do you mean?" Jake's voice took on an almost reverent tone. "There's a hidden shrine about a mile off the main trail that very few people know about. It was built by hermit monks in the 1880s, even before the main shrine was constructed. Local tradition says that St. Francis himself appeared there to a Native American chief, converting him to Christianity on the spot. The church doesn't officially recognize it because it's on such remote and dangerous terrain. But the spiritual energy there is incredible." Margaret felt a flicker of caution. "We've never heard of any hidden shrine in this area. That's because it's not on any official maps," Jake explained. "The Forest Service doesn't want casual hikers attempting to reach it because the trail requires some technical climbing skills. But you three seem like experienced outdoor women, and with your spiritual background, you'd probably appreciate the historical and religious significance more than most people." Rose was clearly intrigued, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What kind of spiritual experiences have people reported there?" Jake seemed to consider his words carefully. "I probably shouldn't say this, but there have been some remarkable accounts. Visions, healing experiences, profound religious revelation. One monk claimed he received a direct message from the Virgin Mary about the future of the church. Another reported seeing angels actually manifested in physical form. It's the kind of place that changes people forever." The three nuns exchanged glances. This was exactly the type of opportunity they had prayed for, a chance to experience something truly extraordinary during their pilgrimage. Helen spoke first, her voice soft but determined. "If God has led us to meet you today, perhaps he wants us to visit this hidden shrine." Margaret remained cautious. "How far off the main trail would we have to go?" "We're expected back at the convent by evening tomorrow." "It would add maybe 4 hours to your total journey," Jake assured her. 2 hours to reach the hidden shrine, time for prayer and reflection, then 2 hours back to rejoin the main trail. You'd still have plenty of time to visit the official shrine and return home on schedule." Rose looked pleadingly at Margaret. "We could think of it as a special blessing, an unexpected gift from God. How many people get the opportunity to pray at a place where saints have actually appeared?" Margaret found herself wavering. Part of her training told her to stick to their established plan, but another part recognized that some of the most profound spiritual experiences came from moments of unexpected grace. What exactly would the route involve? Jake pulled out a detailed topographical map and spread it on a nearby boulder. His finger traced a path that led northeast from their current position, following what appeared to be a game trail through increasingly rugged terrain. "We'd follow this ridgeline for about 1.5 miles, then descend into a small canyon where the shrine is hidden. The trail requires some scrambling over rocks, but nothing that would challenge experienced hikers like yourselves." As he explained, the route, Jake's knowledge of the terrain seemed comprehensive and reassuring. He pointed out landmarks, potential hazards, and even alternate routes in case of emergency. Most convincingly, he offered to guide them personally, ensuring their safety and helping them navigate the more technical sections. "I was planning to spend another day in the area anyway," he said. "It would be my honor to help 3 dedicated servants of God experience something truly miraculous." Helen closed her prayer book and looked directly at Jake. You mentioned that you work in search and rescue. That means you're trained in wilderness safety and emergency response. Absolutely. I've been certified in wilderness first aid for over 15 years, and I carry all the standard emergency equipment. Plus, I have a satellite communicator that can summon help from anywhere in these mountains. Margaret felt her resistance crumbling. The man seemed genuine, experienced, and motivated by sincere religious conviction. Most importantly, he was offering to ensure their safety during what could be the spiritual highlight of their entire pilgrimage. "What do you think?" she asked her companions. Rose nodded enthusiastically. "I think this is exactly the kind of unexpected blessing that makes pilgrimages so special. We came here seeking to draw closer to God, and He's offering us an opportunity to visit a place where He's revealed Himself to others." Helen's response was more measured, but equally positive. "I feel peace about this decision. If this man is willing to guide us safely, and if the shrine is truly a place of spiritual power, then perhaps it's part of God's plan for our journey." Margaret looked one more time at Jake's map, noting the careful detail and obvious authenticity of his markings. Everything about the man suggested competence and genuine spiritual motivation. "All right," she decided, "but we stay together at all times. We follow your guidance exactly, and at the first sign of dangerous conditions, we turn back immediately." Jake's smile seemed to light up the entire forest. "You won't regret this decision, sisters. I promise you an experience that will strengthen your faith and create memories that will last forever." As they began following Jake off the established pilgrimage trail, none of the three nuns noticed the subtle change in his demeanor. The warm, respectful manner remained, but something cold and predatory flickered briefly in his eyes. Something that suggested his promises about memories lasting forever might be more literally true than any of them could possibly imagine. The last marker cross they passed bore the inscription, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." It would be the final biblical verse any of them would ever read. The terrain began changing dramatically within the first half-mile of leaving the main trail. What had started as a gentle forest path quickly became a challenging scramble over loose rock and fallen timber. Jake moved with the confidence of someone who had traversed this route many times, pointing out handholds and warning of unstable rocks before any of the nuns encountered them. "This section always looks worse than it actually is," he called back to them as they navigated a particularly steep section. The monks who originally built this trail chose the most direct route, not necessarily the easiest one. They believed that physical challenge enhanced spiritual preparation. Margaret found herself breathing harder than usual, but she was proud of how well her companions were handling the difficult terrain. Rose attacked each obstacle with her characteristic enthusiasm, while Helen moved with careful, methodical precision. Both younger women were obviously in excellent physical condition from their active lives at the convent. As they climbed higher, Jake shared what seemed to be extensive knowledge about the area's religious history. He spoke about the original Native American sacred sites that had drawn the first Christian missionaries, the struggles of early settlers to establish churches in such remote locations, and the continuing tradition of spiritual pilgrimage that connected modern believers to their historic predecessors. The Native Americans called this area "where earth touches sky," he explained during one of their rest stops. They believed it was a place where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected, making it easier to communicate with the divine. When the first Christian missionaries arrived, they discovered that the indigenous people were already experiencing profound spiritual encounters here. Rose wiped sweat from her forehead and gazed up at the towering peaks surrounding them. It's easy to understand why. Being this close to God's creation, surrounded by such magnificent beauty, you can't help but feel His presence more powerfully. Helen nodded in agreement. "I feel like I'm walking through a cathedral made of stone and sky. Every breath is a prayer, every step an act of worship." Jake watched the three women with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for their spiritual depth. That's exactly the attitude that makes this journey so meaningful. Too many people come to the mountains looking for physical challenge or scenic beauty, but they miss the real purpose, the opportunity to encounter God in a place where His power and creativity are displayed in their purest form. As they continued climbing, Margaret began to notice small inconsistencies in Jake's story. He claimed to be involved with search and rescue operations, but his radio looked more like a standard hiking communicator than professional emergency equipment. He spoke knowledgeably about the area's religious history, but some of his details didn't match what she remembered from her extensive research about local monasteries and missions. Most troubling was his route selection. Despite his claims about following an established trail, they seemed to be bushwhacking through terrain that showed no signs of regular human passage. The trail he was leading them along appeared to be little more than animal paths connecting natural features. When they stopped for lunch in a small clearing, Margaret decided to voice her concerns. "Jake, I have to admit I'm getting a little confused about our location. This doesn't look like any trail I've ever seen, and I'm having trouble matching our route to your map." Jake's response was immediate and reassuring. "I know it seems confusing, but remember, this is a secret route that's deliberately kept hidden from casual hikers. The monks who established it wanted to ensure that only serious spiritual seekers would make the effort to find the hidden shrine. Part of the spiritual preparation involves trusting your guide and having faith that the journey will lead where it's supposed to." Rose looked up from the simple lunch they were sharing. "That actually makes perfect sense from a religious perspective. Many of the great saints wrote about the importance of spiritual surrender, of following God's guidance, even when the path seems unclear." Helen nodded thoughtfully. Saint John of the Cross wrote extensively about the dark night of the soul, those times when we have to trust completely in God's plan, even when we can't see where it's leading us. Margaret felt somewhat mollified by her companion's perspectives, but she still couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Something about Jake's behavior had shifted subtly since they left the main trail. His friendliness remained, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her uncomfortable, especially when he looked at Rose and Helen. "How much farther do we have to go?" she asked, checking her watch. It was already 2:30 p.m. and they had been hiking for over 5 hours. "We're actually very close now," Jake assured her. "Just over that ridge ahead, and then a short descent into the canyon where the shrine is located. We should be there within the hour." As they packed up their lunch remains and prepared to continue, Jake made a suggestion that increased Margaret's discomfort. "The final approach to the shrine requires some careful navigation through a narrow canyon. It would be safer if you ladies removed your religious habits and left them here. The flowing fabric could get caught on rocks or branches, and if someone fell, it could prevent proper rescue techniques." Margaret immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not. We don't remove our habits except in the privacy of our own rooms. It's against our religious rules and our personal convictions." Jake's expression remained understanding, but Margaret thought she detected a flash of anger in his eyes. "Of course, I completely respect your religious commitments. I was only thinking about safety. Perhaps we could find some way to secure the fabric more tightly, or maybe take a slightly longer route that avoids the narrowest sections." Rose looked at Margaret with concern. "Maybe he has a point about safety, Maggie. Our habits are pretty loose, and if the terrain is really that technical—" "No," Margaret said firmly. "We maintain our religious dignity regardless of circumstances. If the route is too dangerous for us to navigate safely while properly dressed, then perhaps we should reconsider this entire detour." For a moment, Jake's friendly mask seemed to slip completely. Margaret caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating in his expression, something that made her blood run cold. But the moment passed so quickly that she wondered if she had imagined it. "You're absolutely right, Sister Margaret," Jake said, his warm smile returning. "I apologize for suggesting anything that would compromise your religious convictions. We'll take the longer route, and I'll make sure everyone stays safe regardless of what you're wearing." But as they began climbing toward the ridge Jake had indicated, Margaret couldn't escape the feeling that they had just crossed some kind of invisible line. Whatever Jake's true intentions might be, she was becoming increasingly certain that he had not been entirely honest about their destination or his motivations for taking them there. She began to pray silently, asking God for wisdom and protection, and hoping desperately that her growing fears were nothing more than the product of an overprotective imagination. But when she looked back at Jake, she saw him watching them with an expression that no longer had anything to do with spiritual guidance or mountain safety. It was the look of a predator who had successfully separated his prey from the safety of the herd and was now calculating the best moment to strike. The ridge Jake had promised turned out to be significantly higher and more challenging than any of the nuns had expected. What should have been a 1-hour climb stretched into 3 grueling hours of scrambling over loose scree and navigating around sheer cliff faces. By the time they reached what Jake claimed was the final summit, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Margaret's unease had grown into genuine alarm. They were now so far from the main pilgrimage trail that even their emergency whistle blasts wouldn't carry to any established rescue points. Worse, the terrain they had just traversed would be nearly impossible to navigate safely in darkness, effectively trapping them in this remote location until dawn. "Jake, we need to turn back immediately," she announced as they caught their breath on the rocky summit. "We're already going to be late returning to the convent, and attempting to continue in failing light would be dangerous for everyone." Jake consulted his watch with what appeared to be genuine surprise. "I had no idea we were moving so slowly. I'm really sorry, sisters. I'm used to hiking with experienced mountaineers who can cover this terrain much faster." He studied the surrounding landscape thoughtfully. "But actually, we're in luck. The hidden shrine is just down in that canyon, maybe 20 minutes away. We could visit it quickly, say some prayers, and then spend the night at the emergency shelter that's maintained there. In the morning, I can guide you back via a much easier route that will have you at your convent by lunchtime." Rose looked hopefully at Margaret. "That actually sounds like a reasonable compromise. We'd still get to experience the hidden shrine, and we'd be safe for the night." Helen nodded in agreement. "I'd rather spend the night in prayer at a sacred site than try to navigate dangerous terrain in the dark." Margaret felt trapped between her instincts and her responsibilities. Every fibre of her being was screaming warnings about Jake and their situation, but she couldn't articulate specific concerns that would justify endangering her companions with a dangerous night descent. "What kind of emergency shelter are we talking about?" "It's a small cabin maintained by the Forest Service for situations exactly like this," Jake explained. "Basic but weatherproof, with emergency supplies including food, water, and communication equipment. Mountain rescue teams use it as a staging area for operations in this sector." The mention of communication equipment was particularly appealing to Margaret. If they could contact the convent and explain their situation, Mother Superior Catherine would be worried but understanding. And if her growing fears about Jake proved justified, access to emergency communications could be literally life-saving. "All right," she decided reluctantly. "But we visit the shrine quickly, then go directly to this shelter. No delays, no detours, and first thing in the morning, we head straight back to civilization." Jake's smile seemed broader than the situation warranted. "Perfect. You're going to love the hidden shrine, sisters. It's unlike anything you've ever experienced." The descent into the canyon was treacherous, requiring them to rappel down several rock faces using ropes that Jake produced from his pack. He demonstrated impressive technical skills, rigging secure anchor points and providing detailed safety instruction. But Margaret noticed that he consistently positioned himself so that he controlled their only means of ascent back to the ridge. Canyon floor was a narrow defile between towering walls of granite, so confined that the afternoon sun barely penetrated to ground level. Ancient pine trees grew at impossible angles from cracks in the rock, their twisted branches creating an almost supernatural atmosphere. It was undeniably beautiful, but it was also claustrophobic and vaguely menacing. "The shrine is just around this bend," Jake announced, as they followed what was now clearly a game trail through the canyon bottom. "Prepare yourselves for something truly remarkable." What they found around the bend was indeed remarkable, but not in the way any of them had expected. Instead of an ancient religious shrine, they discovered a modern campsite that had obviously been prepared well in advance. A large military-style tent was erected against the canyon wall, surrounded by sophisticated camping equipment that included solar panels, a satellite dish, and what appeared to be professional surveillance electronics. Margaret stopped dead in her tracks. "What is this place?" Jake's demeanor changed completely, the friendly facade dropping away like a discarded mask. His voice became cold and businesslike. "This is where your pilgrimage ends, sisters, and where your real education begins." Rose stepped backward instinctively, bumping into Helen, who had gone rigid with fear. "What are you talking about? Where's the shrine you promised us?" "There is no hidden shrine. Jake said with casual brutality. There never was. But don't worry, you're about to experience something much more enlightening than any religious monument could provide. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process their situation. They were trapped in a remote canyon with a man who had obviously planned this entire scenario in advance. The elaborate campsite, the careful route selection, the systematic isolation from any possibility of rescue. Everything had been orchestrated to bring them to this moment. What do you want from us? She asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. What I want is to demonstrate some fundamental truths about the nature of religious faith, feminine purity, and the relationship between power and helplessness. You three represent everything I despise about organized religion. The arrogance, the self-righteousness, the claim to moral superiority. Helen found her voice, though it trembled with fear. We've never done anything to hurt you. We don't even know you. You don't have to know me personally to represent everything that's wrong with your particular form of spiritual delusion, Jake snarled. You walk around in those ridiculous costumes, pretending to be somehow above normal human desires and weaknesses. You claim to have special access to divine truth, special protection from earthly corruption. Well, we're about to test those claims under laboratory conditions. Margaret stepped protectively in front of her younger companion. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish, it won't work. Our faith isn't based on circumstances or comfort. Persecuting us will only strengthen our conviction. We'll see about that, Jake said, reaching into his pack and pulling out a pistol. Here's how this is going to work. You're going to remove those habits, and then we're going to have some very honest conversations about the difference between religious theory and practical reality. Rose gasped and clutched her crucifix. Helen began praying aloud in Latin. Margaret stood her ground, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. No, she said simply. We won't remove our habits. We won't participate in whatever sick fantasy you've constructed, and we won't abandon our faith no matter what you do to us. Jake's eyes blazed with rage. You haven't even heard what I'm planning to do to you yet. It doesn't matter, Margaret replied with a calmness that surprised even her. You can hurt our bodies, but you can't touch our souls. You can kill us, but you can't destroy our faith. Whatever power you think you have over us is an illusion. For a moment, Jake seemed genuinely taken aback by her response. Then his expression hardened into something infinitely more dangerous than mere anger. We'll see how long that brave attitude lasts, he said, chambering around in his pistol. We have all night to explore the limits of your spiritual conviction. As the sun disappeared behind the canyon rim, plunging them into premature darkness, the three nuns huddled together and began to pray. They couldn't know what horrors the next few hours would bring, but they were determined to face them with dignity, courage, and unwavering faith in the God they had pledged their lives to serve. The nightmare was about to begin, but their real test of faith had already started. The first hours of captivity established the brutal pattern that would define their ordeal. Jake had clearly planned every detail of their psychological and spiritual destruction. He forced them to sit in a circle around a battery-powered lantern, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, while he paced around them like a predator toying with wounded prey. Let's start with some basic theology, he announced with mock professorial authority. You claim to have dedicated your lives to serving God, but here you are, completely helpless, abandoned by the deity you've supposedly surrendered everything to serve. How do you reconcile your current situation with your belief in divine protection? Margaret answered immediately. God doesn't promise us freedom from suffering. Christ himself was tortured and murdered. Our faith isn't based on the expectation of earthly comfort or safety. Jake backhanded her viciously, splitting her lip and sending blood spattering across her white wimple. Wrong answer. Try again. Rose began crying, but her voice remained strong. Hurting her doesn't prove anything except that you're capable of violence. Our God is a God of love, not force. Love? Jake laughed harshly. Where's this loving God? Now. Why isn't he sending angels to rescue his faithful servants? Maybe because he doesn't exist, or maybe because he doesn't actually care about you as much as you've convinced yourselves he does. Helen spoke for the first time since the ordeal began, her voice soft but unwavering. Our understanding of God's love isn't dependent on our circumstances. Even if you kill us tonight, that won't diminish the truth of what we believe. Jake stopped pacing and stared at her with a mixture of fascination and rage. You actually believe that, don't you? You honestly think your invisible friend in the sky is going to reward you for enduring whatever I decide to do to you? Yes, Helen said simply. I do. The brutal questioning continued for hours. Jake seemed determined to break their faith through a combination of physical intimidation, logical arguments against religious belief, and graphic descriptions of what he planned to do to them. But with each passing hour, the three nuns seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker, their responses more unified, their courage more evident. Around midnight, Jake's frustration reached a breaking point. He had expected their faith to crumble under pressure, their unity to fracture when confronted with genuine mortal danger. Instead, they prayed together, comforted each other, and met his every challenge with unshakable conviction. Fine, he snarled, grabbing Margaret by the arm and dragging her away from the others. Let's see how strong your faith is when it's just you and me, without your little support group to keep you brave. He forced her into the tent, leaving Rose and Helen tied up outside in the cold mountain air. Margaret could hear them praying, for her, their voices carrying clearly through the thin tent walls. Somehow, knowing that her sisters were interceding for her gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Inside the tent, Jake's assault began with attempts to force her to renounce her vows. He threatened, cajoled, and bargained, promising to release all three of them if she would just admit that her religious beliefs were a lie. Margaret refused every offer, every threat, every promise of mercy. You could save them, Jake whispered, his face inches from her. Just say the words. Just admit that you've wasted your life serving a fantasy, and I'll let all three of you walk out of here. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. Even if I could save their lives by lying about what I believe, it wouldn't truly save them. We'd rather die with our faith intact than live having betrayed everything that gives our lives meaning. Jake's physical assault began shortly after 2 a.m. Margaret's screams echoed through the canyon, but they were screams of pain, not surrender. Through it all, she could hear Rose and Helen singing hymns outside, their voices growing hoarse but never stopping, never faltering. When Jake finally dragged her back outside, Margaret was bloodied and barely conscious, but she was still praying. Rose and Helen wept when they saw her condition, but their tears were mixed with awe at her incredible courage. Your turn, Jake announced, reaching for Rose. But as he grabbed her arm, something unexpected happened. Rose looked up at him with eyes full of pity rather than fear. I forgive you, she said softly. Whatever you do to us, whatever you've already done, I forgive you. God loves you just as much as he loves us, and it's not too late for you to turn away from this darkness. Jake recoiled as if she had slapped him. I don't want your forgiveness. I want you to admit that your God is a lie and your faith is worthless. Our faith has already proven its worth, Helen said quietly. We've found peace and strength in the midst of terror. We've discovered that love is stronger than hatred, that hope survives even in hopelessness. You can destroy our bodies, but you can't touch what really matters about us. Jake's rage exploded into mindless violence. He struck Rose repeatedly, screaming obscenities and blasphemies, demanding that she recant her beliefs. But with each blow, Rose's prayers grew louder, her voice more defiant. She began reciting the Beatitudes, her words ringing through the canyon like a battle cry. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you, falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Something inside Jake snapped completely. The careful psychological torture gave way to frenzied, animalistic brutality. He dragged Rose into the tent, and for the next hour, the canyon echoed with sounds that would haunt any decent person's nightmares. But through it all, Margaret and Helen never stopped praying, never stopped singing, never stopped calling out words of love and encouragement to their suffering sister. When Rose was finally dragged back outside, she was barely breathing. But her first words were to comfort her companion. "It's almost over," she whispered through broken lips. "I can see them, angels, waiting for us. We're going home soon." Helen cradled Rose's battered head in her lap, tears streaming down her face. "I love you, sister. You've shown me what true courage looks like." Margaret, despite her own terrible injuries, managed to crawl close enough to take Rose's hand. "You've been the heart of our community for so many years. Your joy, your laughter, your incredible love. You've made all of us better people." Jake stood over them, breathing heavily, covered in their blood. But instead of the satisfaction he had expected to feel, he was consumed by a rage that seemed to grow larger with each moment. Their continued faith, their mutual love, their refusal to break even under the most extreme torture. It was driving him toward complete madness. "Why won't you just give up?" he screamed at them. "Why won't you just admit that this is all meaningless? That your God has abandoned you? That your faith is just a lie you tell yourselves?" Helen looked up at him with eyes that somehow still held compassion. "Because we can see what you can't see. We know who we really are, and we know where we're going. You're the one who's lost, not us." Those words proved to be Helen's death sentence. Jake's assault on her was the most vicious yet, fueled by a fury that seemed to consume all rational thought. But even as he tortured her, Helen continued to pray, not just for herself and her sisters, but for him. "Father, forgive him," she gasped between screams. "He doesn't understand what he's doing. Show him your mercy. Show him your love. Don't let his soul be lost forever." Her prayers for his salvation seemed to drive Jake into an almost demonic frenzy. When he finally killed her, it was with his bare hands, strangling the life from her throat, while she whispered final words of love to Margaret and Rose. Tell the children at school that I love them," she managed to say, before her voice was silenced forever. Dawn was still hours away when Jake turned his attention to Margaret for the final time. Rose had died shortly after Helen, her body finally succumbing to the brutal injuries she had sustained. Margaret was alone now, the sole survivor of their sacred pilgrimage, facing a man who had descended completely into madness. But something had changed in the hours since Helen's death. Jake's rage seemed to have burned itself out, leaving behind something even more disturbing, a cold, calculating emptiness that suggested his sanity had finally snapped completely. "Just you and me now, Sister Margaret," he said with eerie calm. "Your two friends died still believing in their invisible God, still convinced that their suffering had some kind of cosmic meaning. What about you? Are you ready to join them in their delusion, or would you like to save yourself by finally acknowledging reality?" Margaret looked at the bodies of her beloved sisters, then back at Jake. Her voice was hoarse from hours of screaming and praying, but it carried a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical capability. "They didn't die in delusion," she said. "They died in truth. They faced the worst evil you could inflict, and they never stopped loving. They never stopped believing. They never stopped hoping. That's not delusion. That's the most profound reality I've ever witnessed." Jake studied her with the detached interest of a scientist examining an unusual specimen. "You really are going to die for this fantasy, aren't you? You're actually going to let me kill you rather than admit that your entire life has been built on a lie." "My entire life has been built on love," Margaret corrected him. "Love for God, love for my sisters, love for the people we serve. That love is the most real thing in this canyon right now. It's more real than your hatred, more powerful than your violence, more lasting than anything you can do to my body." For the first time since the ordeal began, Jake seemed genuinely puzzled. "How can you say that? Look around you. Your God didn't protect you. Your faith didn't save you. Your love didn't prevent any of this suffering. How can you still believe in something that has failed you so completely?" Margaret managed a broken smile. "Our God didn't fail us. He gave us exactly what we needed: the strength to remain faithful, the courage to face death without compromising our beliefs, and the privilege of dying for what we love most. What more could we possibly ask for?" Jake's facade of calm began to crack. "You're insane. All of you were insane. I've just proven that everything you believed in is worthless, and you're too deluded to even understand what I've accomplished." "What you've accomplished," Margaret said softly, "is proving that love is stronger than hate, that faith survives even when everything else is stripped away, and that some things really are worth dying for. You've given us the greatest gift possible, the chance to discover that our beliefs aren't just ideas we hold in our minds, but truths we're willing to stake our lives on." Jake raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Shut up. Just shut up. I don't want to hear any more of your religious garbage." Margaret closed her eyes and began to pray, not for rescue or relief, but for Jake's soul. "Father, he's lost and broken and consumed by darkness. Please don't let our deaths be meaningless. Use them somehow to bring him back to you. Show him that your love is bigger than his hatred, that your mercy is deeper than his sins." The prayer seemed to have a profound effect on Jake. His hands began trembling so violently that he could barely hold the gun. Tears started streaming down his face, though whether from rage or some other emotion was impossible to tell. "Stop praying for me!" he screamed. "I don't want your prayers. I don't want your forgiveness. I want you to hate me. I want you to curse God for abandoning you." But Margaret continued praying, her voice growing stronger, even as her body grew weaker. "Father, let him know that you haven't given up on him. Let him know that it's never too late to turn away from darkness and walk toward light. Use our sacrifice to plant seeds of hope in his heart." Jake's breakdown was complete now. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, the gun forgotten in the dirt beside him. "Why?" he wailed. "Why are you praying for me? After everything I've done to you, after all the pain I've caused, why are you asking your God to save me?" Margaret opened her eyes and looked at him with infinite compassion. "Because that's what love does. It doesn't give up, even on people who seem beyond redemption. It doesn't stop hoping, even when hope seems impossible. And it doesn't stop believing that everyone, even you, is worth saving." Those were Sister Margaret O'Connor's final words. Jake shot her 3 times in the chest, but her last act was to whisper a prayer of forgiveness as she died. Jake Morrison spent the next 3 days in the canyon, paralyzed by the magnitude of what he had done. The elaborate psychological experiment he had designed to prove the worthlessness of religious faith had instead demonstrated its incredible power. The 3 nuns had faced the worst evil he could devise, and they had emerged victorious, not by escaping or fighting back, but by refusing to let him destroy what mattered most about them. When rational thought finally returned, Jake realized that he faced a choice between confessing his crimes and spending the rest of his life in prison, or attempting to cover up what had happened and hope that the bodies would never be found. His self-preservation instincts won out over any lingering conscience. The canyon where he had committed his atrocities was perfect for concealment. It was so remote that even experienced search teams would be unlikely to find it, and the steep walls would make it nearly impossible to access without technical climbing equipment. If he could dispose of the evidence properly, the 3 nuns could simply vanish without a trace. Jake's first task was dealing with the bodies. He had come, prepared for this possibility, bringing chemicals and tools that would help him destroy any evidence of what had transpired. Over the next day and a half, he systematically eliminated every trace of the murders, reducing the remains to nothing that could be identified or recovered. But he made one crucial mistake. The religious habits the nuns had died wearing held deep symbolic significance for Jake. Throughout their ordeal, these garments had represented everything he hated about organized religion: the separation from normal human desires, the claim to moral superiority, the pretense of being somehow above earthly corruption. In his twisted mind, keeping the habits as trophies seemed appropriate. They would serve as private reminders of his victory over religious delusion, proof that he had successfully tested the limits of faith and found them wanting. He carefully cleaned and preserved the garments, then arranged them in the canyon as a kind of memorial to his triumph. The personal items, Margaret's journal, Helen's glasses, Rose's locket, became part of his grotesque display. He positioned them around the habits like artifacts in a museum exhibit, creating a shrine to his own dark achievement. Finally, he carved the word betrayed into the stone floor of the canyon, expressing his belief that the nuns' God had abandoned them in their hour of greatest need. Jake's exit from the canyon required careful planning. He had to climb out the way they had entered, then navigate back to the main pilgrimage trail without leaving any obvious tracks. He also had to account for his absence during the time when search teams would inevitably be looking for the missing nuns. His solution was elegant in its simplicity. When the search for the three nuns began, Jake Morrison volunteered to help, positioning himself as one of the most dedicated and knowledgeable members of the rescue effort. He spent 2 weeks hiking through the mountains with other volunteers, searching for the women he had murdered, offering comfort to their grieving religious community, and helping to develop theories about what might have happened to them. His insider knowledge of search and rescue operations allowed him to subtly misdirect the investigation. When teams came close to the area where he had taken the nuns, he found ways to steer them in other directions. When promising leads emerged, he was often the one who debunked them or suggested alternative explanations. Most importantly, Jake was the one who discovered the scattered rosary beads near the emergency shelter at mile marker 7. He had planted them there during one of his search missions, creating false evidence that pointed investigators away from the actual crime scene. The trail of beads leading toward the stream suggested that the nuns had gotten lost and tried to follow water back to civilization, a logical theory that explained their disappearance without requiring anyone to look for their body. For 15 years, Jake's deception held. The case went cold, the investigation was eventually suspended, and the three nuns became nothing more than a tragic mystery that haunted the local religious community. Jake went on with his life, maintaining his reputation as a dedicated search and rescue volunteer while privately savoring his perfect crime. But perfect crimes have a way of unraveling, especially when they're committed by people who can't resist the temptation to revisit the scene of their crime. Mark Thompson had been exploring caves in the Colorado Rockies for over 12 years, but the system he discovered in October 2002 was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The entrance was hidden behind a boulder field that most hikers would never think to investigate, accessible only through a narrow fissure that required serious technical skills to navigate. Mark was a software engineer from Denver, with a passion for underground exploration. He spent most of his free time mapping cave systems for the National Speleological Society, documenting underground features that might have scientific or historical significance. His work was methodical and precise, combining GPS technology with traditional surveying techniques to create detailed maps of Colorado's hidden underground world. The cave he entered on October 12, 2002, had been carved by centuries of water flow through limestone deposits. The main chamber was enormous, with a cathedral ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of his powerful LED headlamp. Formations of flowstone and calcite created an otherworldly landscape that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Mark had explored dozens of similar caves, but something about this one felt different from the moment he rappelled through the entrance fissure. The air carried a strange quality that he couldn't quite identify. Not the musty dampness typical of most cave systems, but something that seemed to whisper of human presence and ancient secrets. He began his standard documentation process, photographing formations and taking GPS readings for his mapping project. The cave appeared to be completely natural, with no signs of human modification or historical use. But as he moved deeper into the main chamber, his headlamp beams swept across something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Black fabric, carefully arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern against the far wall of the cave. Mark's heart hammered as he approached what he now realized were 3 complete religious habits, positioned as if their owners were kneeling in prayer before a natural altar formation. Each habit was intact and perfectly preserved, complete with rope belts, wooden crucifixes, and rosary beads that caught his light like scattered stars. But there were no bodies inside the clothing. The preservation was extraordinary, suggesting that the cave's cool, dry environment had protected the garments from decay for many years. Mark estimated that the habits had been in the cave for at least a decade, possibly much longer. But how had they gotten here? And where were the women? Who had worn them? As Mark photographed the scene, he noticed personal items scattered around the habits with obvious deliberation. A leather journal lay open beside one of the garments, its pages yellow with age, but still legible. Wire-rimmed glasses sat folded on top of another habit, positioned with careful precision. A silver locket hung from a small stone outcropping, catching his light like a beacon. But the most disturbing discovery was the carved inscription on the cave floor directly in front of the arranged habits. Someone had used metal tools to etch a single word deep into the limestone. Betray. Mark's hands shook as he took photographs of everything, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. This was clearly a crime scene, but it was unlike any crime scene he had ever heard of. The careful arrangement of evidence, the symbolic positioning of personal items, the religious significance of the location, everything suggested a perpetrator with a specific message to communicate. The leather journal proved to be the most revealing piece of evidence. Despite some water damage and age-related deterioration, most of the handwritten entries were still readable. The final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, told a story of deception, betrayal, and mounting terror. September 15th, 1987. Something is wrong. The man who offered to guide us to the hidden shrine is not who he claimed to be. Rose noticed him speaking angrily into a radio device, though he told us he was checking weather conditions. When I asked him about it, his entire demeanor changed. The friendly mountain guide disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. Another entry, apparently written hours later, was even more chilling. "We are lost. This is not the way to any shrine." When I confronted him about our location, he laughed and said we would learn the truth about religious faith before this journey was over. Helen is praying constantly. Rose is trying to stay brave, but I can see the fear in her eyes. We are trapped in a canyon with a madman, and no one knows where we are. The final entry was barely legible, written in desperate haste. "He has a gun. He says he wants to teach us about the difference between religious theory and reality. We are going to die here. If anyone ever finds this journal, please tell our sisters at St. Catherine's Convent that we never stopped believing. Our faith sustained us to the end. God forgive our killer, and may our sacrifice somehow serve his purposes." Mark sat in the cave for nearly an hour, reading and rereading the journal entries, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. These were clearly the remains of a multiple homicide that had been concealed for 15 years. The religious habits, the personal effects, the location itself, everything pointed to a crime motivated by hatred of organized religion and directed specifically at these three women because of their faith. When Mark finally called 911 from his satellite phone, his voice was shaking so badly that the dispatcher had difficulty understanding him. But the words "murder victims" and "missing nuns" were enough to set emergency response protocols in motion. Within hours, the remote canyon would be swarming with investigators, and the long-buried secrets of September 1987 would finally begin to emerge. What Mark couldn't have known, as he waited for rescue teams to arrive, was that the man responsible for the atrocity he had discovered was probably already aware that his perfect crime was about to unravel. And that knowledge would drive Jake Morrison to desperate measures that would put even more innocent lives at risk. Detective Sarah Walsh had been retired for 7 years when the call came that would define the final chapter of her law enforcement career. At 67, she was living quietly in a cabin outside Colorado Springs, tending her garden and trying to forget the cases that had haunted her sleepless nights for decades. But when the current lead detective, James Morrison, requested her assistance with the cave discovery, she knew immediately that her retirement was over. The irony wasn't lost on her that Detective Morrison shared a surname with the man who would eventually be identified as the... But in October 2002, Jake Morrison was still just another helpful volunteer in the search effort, a respected member of the mountain rescue community whose expertise and dedication had earned him the gratitude of dozens of families over the years. Detective Walsh's first visit to the cave confirmed what she had suspected from the moment she heard Mark Thompson's initial report. This wasn't just a murder scene. It was a carefully constructed message left by a killer who wanted his crimes to be discovered, but only after enough time had passed for him to feel safe from prosecution. Whoever did this has been carrying around a massive psychological burden for 15 years, Walsh explained to the investigation team during their first briefing. The arrangement of evidence, the symbolic positioning of personal items, The carved inscription. These aren't the actions of someone trying to hide their crimes. This is someone who wants the world to understand what they accomplish. The religious habits were carefully transported to the state crime lab, where DNA analysis confirmed what everyone already suspected. The garments had been worn by sisters Margaret O'Connor, Rose Martinez, and Helen Thompson on the day they disappeared. Trace evidence found on the fabric included hair samples, skin cells, and most disturbingly, bloodstains that suggested violent death. Sister Margaret's journal provided the most detailed account of their final hours, but forensic analysis revealed even more disturbing information. Several pages had been torn out, apparently by the killer, leaving gaps in the narrative at crucial moments. However, advanced imaging techniques allowed investigators to recover impressions left on underlying pages, revealing text that painted an even more horrific picture of their ordeal. The recovered passages described systematic psychological and physical torture designed to break their religious faith. The killer had forced them to debate theology while inflicting pain, demanding that they renounce their beliefs in exchange for mercy. Most chillingly, the journal revealed that the killer had specifically targeted them because of their religious commitment, viewing their faith as a challenge to his own worldview that needed to be destroyed. Dr. Patricia Williams, the FBI's leading expert on crimes motivated by religious hatred, was brought in to develop a psychological profile of the perpetrator. Her analysis painted a picture of an intelligent, organized individual with deep-seated hostility toward religious institutions and feminine purity. This killer sees himself as conducting an experiment, Dr. Williams explained to the task force. He's testing his belief that religious faith is nothing more than psychological weakness that will crumble under sufficient pressure. The fact that his victims maintained their convictions until death would have been profoundly disturbing to his. The profile suggested that the killer was likely someone familiar with the area's terrain and rescue operations. Probably a local resident with legitimate reasons to be in the mountains without arousing suspicion. Most importantly, Dr. Williams believed he would have inserted himself into the original investigation, either as a volunteer searcher or as someone offering information to law enforcement. This insight led investigators to re-examine the files from the original 1987 investigation, focusing on individuals who had been particularly active in the search effort. One name appeared repeatedly in witness statements, volunteer coordination lists, and evidence reports: Jake Morris. Jake had been one of the first volunteers to join the search, one of the most dedicated participants throughout the 2-week effort, and one of the last to give up hope. He had hiked hundreds of miles looking for the missing nuns, comforted their grieving religious community, and even discovered the scattered rosary beads that had provided the investigation's only significant. But when investigators looked more closely at Jake's involvement, troubling patterns began to emerge. He had consistently volunteered for search assignments in remote areas where he would be working alone or with minimal supervision. He had been present when several promising leads were discovered and subsequently debunked. Most suspiciously, he had been the one to find the rosary beads that had misdirected the entire investigation toward the stream and away from the actual crime. Detective Morrison found himself in the impossible position of investigating his own father. James Morrison had grown up hearing stories about Jake's heroic efforts to find the missing nuns, and had chosen law enforcement partly because of his admiration for his father's public service. The revelation that Jake might have been the killer all along shattered everything James thought he knew about his family. "I need to recuse myself from this investigation," James told Detective Walsh during an emotional meeting 3 days after the cave discovery. "I can't be objective about evidence that might implicate my father, and I can't trust my own judgment when it comes to evaluating his actions." Walsh nodded understandingly. She had seen similar conflicts destroy good officers before, and she respected Morrison's integrity in recognizing his limitations. "The state will take over the investigation from here, but I need you to understand that if your father is responsible for these murders, we will prove it and prosecute accordingly." James Morrison looked out the window toward the mountains where his father had spent so many years conducting rescue operations. "If he did this, then everything I believed about him was a lie. And if he's innocent, then we're destroying the reputation of a man who spent 15 years trying to bring these women home." Detective Walsh placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "The truth is the truth. regardless of how much it hurts. These 3 women deserve justice, and their families deserve answers. We're going to give them both. But as the investigation intensified and evidence began pointing more clearly toward Jake Morrison, Detective Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. If Jake realized he was about to be exposed, there was no telling what desperate measures he might take to protect. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the mountains that had hidden his secrets for 15 years were about to become the stage for a final deadly confrontation. Jake Morrison had been monitoring police communications with a handheld scanner for 15 years, a habit left over from his legitimate search and rescue work. When he heard the radio chatter about a significant discovery in a remote cave system, he knew immediately that his perfect crime was about to unfold. The news reports were vague, mentioning only that hikers had discovered evidence related to the 1987 disappearance of 3 nuns. But Jake didn't need details to understand what had happened. Mark Thompson had found his trophy room, his carefully preserved monument to the destruction of religious faith. For 3 days, Jake wrestled with his options. He could run, disappearing into the vast wilderness areas where he had spent decades perfecting his survivals. He could surrender, hoping that his age and previous community service might earn him some mercy. Or he could fight, taking as many people with him as possible before the inevitable end. The decision was made for him when Detective Walsh arrived at his cabin on the morning of October 15th with a search warrant and backup officers. Jake watched through his window as the police vehicles surrounded his property, knowing that his freedom measured in minutes rather than hours. He had prepared for this possibility, keeping a loaded rifle and enough supplies for an extended mountain survival expedition ready at all times. If his crimes were finally going to be exposed, he would at least control the circumstances of his capture, or Jake slipped out the back door of his cabin as police officers approached the front entrance. His knowledge of the local terrain gave him a significant advantage. He could navigate the maze of game trails and hidden ravines without being seen, while the pursuing officers would be forced to follow established paths or risk getting lost. In unfamiliar wilderness, his destination was the cave where he had displayed his trophies for 15 years. If his story was going to end, it seemed appropriate that it should end where his transformation from rescuer to killer had been complete. The cave had become sacred ground to him, the one place in the world where he felt completely honest about who he really was. The pursuit began. Detective Walsh coordinated with local law enforcement and the state police to establish a perimeter around the area where Jake had been seen. But the terrain was rugged and the weather was deteriorating, with heavy clouds promising the first snow of the season. "He knows these mountains better than anyone," Walsh explained to the tactical team during their briefing. "He's had 15 years to plan escape routes and identify hiding places. We need to assume he's armed and extremely dangerous, and we need to be prepared for the possibility that he won't surrender voluntarily." The chase stretched into its second day as Jake led his pursuers deeper into the wilderness. He moved like a man who had nothing left to lose, taking risks that would have been suicidal for less experienced outdoorsmen. Several times, search teams thought they had cornered him, only to discover that he had vanished through terrain that seemed impossible. On the evening of October 16th, Jake made a crucial mistake. Exhausted and hypothermic from 2 days in the mountains, he decided to take shelter in a hunting cabin he had used many times over the years. What he didn't know was that the cabin's owner, a local rancher named Bill Patterson, had seen smoke from the chimney and called police to report a possible break. Detective Walsh and her team surrounded the cabin just before dawn on October 17th. Inside, Jake Morrison sat by a dying fire, cleaning his rifle and staring at a photograph of the 3 nuns taken during their final pilgrimage. He looked older than his 62 years, haggard and broken by the psychological weight of his crimes. "Jake Morrison, this is Detective Walsh with the Colorado State Police," she called through a megaphone. "The cabin is surrounded. Come out with your hands visible and no one needs to get..." Jake's response came in the form of a rifle shot that shattered the cabin's front window. The tactical team immediately took cover, recognizing that they were dealing with a desperate man who had chosen violence over surrender. The standoff lasted for nearly 6 hours. Jake occasionally fired shots to keep the officers at bay, but he seemed more interested in talking than fighting. Through the broken window, he shouted confessions that confirmed everything investigators had suspected about the murders of the 3 nuns. "They never broke!" he screamed at one point, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "I did everything I could think of to destroy their faith, and they just got stronger. Even when I killed them, they were praying for my soul. How is that possible? How can anyone believe that strongly in something invisible?" Detective Walsh tried to engage him in negotiation, hoping to bring the situation to a peaceful conclusion. "Jake, I know you've been carrying this burden for 15 years. Let us help you. Come out and tell your story properly. Help us understand what happened up." "You want to Jake laughed. "I'll tell you what happened. I proved that God doesn't exist, and then I discovered that it doesn't matter. Those women found something in their faith that was stronger than anything I could do to them. They won, Detective Walsh. Even in death, they..." As the standoff continued, Jake's statements became increasingly erratic and self-incriminating. He described the murders in graphic detail, explained how he had disposed of the bodies, and revealed the psychological motivations that had driven him to target religious women specifically. "I thought I was conducting an experiment," he said, during one of his longer months. "I thought I was proving that religious faith was just weakness dressed up as virtue. But they showed me something I wasn't prepared for. They showed me that some people really can love their enemies, really can forgive the unforgivable, really can find peace in the middle of..." The end came suddenly and violently. As darkness began to fall, Jake apparently decided that he had said everything he needed to say. He emerged from the cabin with his rifle raised, advancing on the police positions while continuing to... The tactical team had no choice but to defend themselves. Jake Morrison died instantly from multiple gunshot wounds, falling in the snow just yards from the cabin where he had made his final stand. In his jacket pocket, investigators found a handwritten letter addressed to the families of the 3 nuns he had murdered. The letter was a rambling, incoherent confession that mixed genuine remorse with continued justification for his crimes. But the final paragraph was written in a clear, steady hand that suggested moments of lucidity in his final. "I killed your daughters because I thought their faith was... I tortured them to prove that their God was a fan. But they died still believing, still loving, still forgiving. They were better people than I could ever hope to be, and they proved that there are things in this world worth dying for. I'm sorry it took me 15 years to admit that they were right, and I was..." The death of Jake Morrison brought a form of closure to the investigation, but it also raised new questions about how such evil could hide behind a facade of community service for so many years. Detective Walsh found herself leading not just a criminal investigation, but a process of collective healing for the families, religious communities, and law enforcement agencies that had been touched by the Mother Superior Catherine, now 78 years old and frail but still mentally sharp, was among the first to hear about Jake's confession and death. She received the news in the same prayer garden where she had blessed the 3 nuns before their final pilgrimage 15 years ago. "I feel no satisfaction in his death," she told Detective Walsh during their private meeting. "My heart breaks for his family, especially for Detective Morrison, who must live with the knowledge of what his father became. But I am grateful that the truth has finally been revealed, and that Margaret, Rose, and Helen can rest in..." The investigation's conclusion allowed for a proper memorial service for the 3 murdered nuns. The ceremony was held at St. Catherine's Convent, attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the women's ministry. Former students of Sister Rose spoke about her infectious joy and unwavering encouragement. Fellow nuns shared memories of Sister Margaret's wisdom and Sister Helen's quiet spiritual. Mark Thompson, the cave explorer, whose discovery had finally solved the case, attended the memorial service and spoke about the profound impact the experience had had on his life. "I'm not a religious man," he said, "but standing in that cave, seeing how carefully their habits had been arranged, feeling the presence of something sacred in that place, it changed me. I believe they guided me to find them, so their story could finally be..." The cave where the murders had taken place was eventually declared a crime scene and sealed off from public. However, representatives from various religious communities successfully petitioned to have the site consecrated as a memorial to religious martyrs. A small chapel was built at the entrance, and the interior was preserved as a place of prayer and Detective James Morrison struggled with the revelation about his father's crimes, ultimately leaving law enforcement to become a counselor, specializing in helping family members of criminals cope with their trauma. In his final report as a police officer, he wrote, "I grew up believing my father was a hero who had dedicated his life to helping others. Learning that he was actually a killer who had deceived everyone, including his own family, has forced me to question everything I thought I knew about human nature. But I've also learned that evil can hide behind any facade, and that our responsibility as human beings is to keep searching for truth, no matter how painful it might be." The case led to significant changes in how missing persons investigations are conducted in Colorado. The discovery highlighted the importance of never completely closing cold cases, and resulted in the establishment of a special unit dedicated to re-examining unsolved disappearances using new technology and investigative. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen became a powerful testimony to the strength of religious faith and the triumph of love over hatred. Their refusal to compromise their beliefs, even in the face of torture and death, inspired people of all faiths around the world. The Diocese of Colorado Springs initiated the process for declaring the three nuns martyrs, recognizing that they had died specifically because of their religious beliefs and their refusal to renounce their faith. While the formal canonization process would take many years, the local church had already begun referring to them as the Martyred Sisters of Sacred Heart. Their story was featured in numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies about religious persecution and the psychology of faith under extreme duress. But for those who had known them personally, they were remembered not as victims of a brutal crime, but as women of extraordinary courage who had lived and died according to their deepest. 5 years after the resolution of the case, the Memorial Chapel of the Martyred Sisters had become one of Colorado's most visited religious sites. Pilgrims from around the world traveled to the remote mountain location to pray, reflect, and draw inspiration from the story of three women who had refused to let evil triumph over love. The chapel was built using stone quarried from the mountain itself, creating a structure that seemed to emerge naturally from the landscape. Inside, 3 simple wooden crosses marked the spots where the nuns' habits had been found, while their personal effects were displayed in a place of honor near. Sister Agnes, now the elderly historian of St. Catherine's Convent, served as the chapel's official guide for visiting pilgrims. Despite being in her 80s, she made the difficult journey to the memorial site several times each month, sharing stories about the 3 martyred nuns and explaining the significance of their sacrifice. "People often ask me how I can speak so calmly about such a terrible crime," Sister Agnes would tell. "But you have to understand, Margaret, Rose, and Helen didn't lose their battle with evil. They won it. They proved that there are things more powerful than hatred, more lasting than violence, more important than life." The memorial chapel became particularly meaningful to parents who had lost children to violence, spouses who had been widowed by crime, and anyone who had struggled to find meaning in senseless. The example of the 3 nuns, who had faced the worst evil imaginable while maintaining their faith, hope, and love, provided a model for how ordinary people could respond to extraordinary suffering. Mark Thompson continued his cave exploration work, but he never forgot the discovery that had changed his life. He established a non-profit organization that used underground exploration techniques to assist in finding missing persons, and had been credited with helping to solve 6 other cold cases in Colorado and neighboring states. "Every time I rappel into a dark cave, I think about Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen," Mark said during a television interview on the 5th anniversary of his death. "They remind me that even in the darkest places, there can be evidence of love, courage, and hope. My job isn't just mapping geological formations, it's helping to bring truth to light and giving families the answers they deserve." Detective Sarah Walsh published a book about the case titled Faith in Darkness: The Sacred Heart Mountain Murders. The book became a bestseller but Walsh donated all proceeds to a scholarship fund established in memory of the three nuns. The Astur scholarships provided financial assistance for young women pursuing careers in education, social work, and religious service. "I've investigated hundreds of crimes during my career," Walsh wrote in the book's conclusion, "but I've never encountered anything like the courage displayed by Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen. They teach us that there are forms of victory that transcend physical survival, and that love really can be stronger than death." The ripple effects of their story continue to spread in unexpected ways. A maximum security prison in Texas began using accounts of the nuns' forgiveness and prayers for their killer as part of a rehabilitation program for violent offenders. Several inmates reported that learning about the sisters' response to torture had inspired them to seek redemption and make amends for their own. A medical school in Boston incorporated the case into their curriculum on treating trauma victims, using the nuns' psychological resilience as an example of how strong spiritual beliefs could provide protection against even the most severe psychological. Most remarkably, the Diocese of Denver reported a significant increase in religious vocations following the widespread publicity about the martyred sisters. Young women from across the country wrote to St. Catherine's Convent, explaining that the example of Margaret, Rose, and Helen had inspired them to consider religious life. "They're showing us what it really means to be a nun," said Maria Santos, a 23-year-old nursing student who entered the convent 2 years after the case was resolved. "It's not about hiding from the world or avoiding difficult situations. It's about having such a deep relationship with God that nothing, not even death, can separate you." The three nuns' rooms at St. Catherine's Convent were preserved, exactly as they had left them on September 15, 1980. Visitors could see Sister Margaret's accounting ledgers, still open to the page she had been working on before the pilgrimage. Sister Rose's classroom displayed her lesson plans about teaching children kindness, and Sister Helen's prayer book lay open to Psalm 23. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not." But perhaps the most powerful testament to their legacy was found in the letters that arrived daily at the convent from people around the world who had been touched by their story. Cancer patients wrote about finding strength to face chemotherapy by thinking about the nuns' courage. Parents of murdered children described how the sisters' example of forgiveness had helped them let go of consuming hatred. Missionaries in dangerous locations carried photocopies of Sister Margaret's journal, drawing inspiration from her final words about trusting in God's plan, even when it led through. One letter, from a former gang member who had found faith while serving a life sentence for murder, captured the essence of what the three nuns had accomplished. "I used to think that religious people were just weak, that faith was for people who couldn't handle reality. But when I read about what those sisters went through, how they kept loving and forgiving even while being tortured, I realized I was wrong. They weren't weak. They were the strongest people I've ever heard of. They showed me that real strength isn't about violence or control. It's about loving people even when they hurt you, and believing in goodness even when you're surrounded by evil." As the 10th anniversary of the case's resolution approached, plans were announced for a major expansion of the memorial chapel. The new facility would include a retreat center where people could come for extended periods of prayer and reflection, following in the spiritual footsteps of the three martyrs. The expansion was funded entirely through private donations, with contributions coming from every continent and every major religious tradition. Jewish rabbis, Muslim imams, Buddhist monks, and Christian pastors all praise the universal message of the nun's sacrifice, that love transcends religious boundaries, and that the willingness to suffer for one's deepest convictions is something all faiths. On September 15, 2012, exactly 25 years after Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen began their final pilgrimage, a special ceremony was held at the Memorial Chapel of the Martyred Sisters. Representatives from religious communities around the world gathered to dedicate a new hiking trail that would allow pilgrims to follow the same route the three nuns had taken on their way to encounter evil and transform it through love. The Martyrs' Trail began at the original trailhead, where Father Rodriguez had photographed the three women for the last time, and ended at the chapel built over the cave where their habits had been discovered. Along the way, markers told the story of their journey, From the joy and anticipation of their departure to the courage and faith of their final. Mother Superior Catherine, now 88 and confined to a wheelchair, was present for the dedication. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, she offered a prayer that seemed to capture everything the three nuns had lived and done. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of Margaret, Rose, and Helen's witness. They showed us that evil cannot ultimately triumph over good, that hatred cannot overcome love, and that even death cannot separate us from you. Help us to live with the same courage they showed, to love with the same generosity they demonstrated, and to trust in your goodness, even when we cannot understand. May their sacrifice continue to bear fruit in the lives of all who hear their story. And may we all be found faithful when our own time of testing comes. As the ceremony concluded and the pilgrims began their descent from the mountain, many reported experiencing something they struggled to put into words. Some described a profound sense. Others spoke of feeling the presence of the three martyred nuns, and a few claimed to have heard voices singing hymns carried on the mountain. But perhaps the most fitting tribute to Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen was the simple fact that their story continued to change lives, continued to inspire courage, and continued to prove that some victories can only be achieved through surrender. Some strength can only be found in weakness, and some forms of love can only be perfected through this. They had begun their pilgrimage seeking a closer relationship with God, and they had found it in the most unlikely place imaginable, in a hidden canyon, where evil had done its worst and been overcome by something infinitely more powerful. Their journey had ended in death, but their witness would live forever, carried forward by everyone who refused to let hatred have the final word, who chose love over revenge, and who believed that light would always triumph over Thera. Last photograph of Sisters Margaret, Rose, and Helen still hung in the memorial chapel, showing them smiling at the base of Mount Sacred Heart as they began their sacred journey. Below the photograph, carved in stone, were the words that had become the unofficial motto of all who drew inspiration from their story. They walked in faith, they died in truth, they live in love. Their pilgrimage had lasted only 3 days, but their impact would endure for all eternity. And in the hearts of those who heard their story, the Sacred Heart Mountain would forever be a place where heaven and earth had touched, where ordinary women had accomplished extraordinary things, and where the power of faith had proven stronger than the deepest darkness the human heart. The 3 nuns had sought God on a mountain, and they had failed. But more than that, they had revealed him to a world that desperately needed to see that love was real, that hope was justified, and that even in the face of unspeakable evil, goodness would always find a way. Their story was complete, but their legacy would continue as long as people needed reminders that courage, that forgiveness was achievable, and that the light of faith could never truly be reached, no matter how determined the darkness might be to snuff it out. In the end, Sisters Margaret O'Connor, Rose Martinez, and Helen Thompson had accomplished something far greater than completing a simple pilgrimage to a mountain shrine. They had become living proof that the human spirit, when anchored in divine love, could endure anything and overcome everything. They had shown the world what martyrdom meant, not merely dying for one's beliefs, but living those beliefs so completely that even death could not diminish their power. And on the wind that swept through the mountain passes where they had suffered and died, pilgrims still claimed to hear their voices, singing the ancient hymns of faith, hope, and love that had sustained them through their darkest hours and carried them safely home to the presence of the God they had served. So faithfully, their pilgrimage was over, but their journey into legend had just begun.